What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. For years, the Kremlin lived inside a carefully constructed illusion. An illusion of distance, illusion of safety, illusion that geography itself was a shield. Factories hidden deep inside Russia, hundreds and hundreds of miles away from Ukraine, were supposed to be completely untouchable, out of reach, safe by default. Putin genuinely believed that if something was far enough, buried deep enough and surrounded by enough air defense systems, Ukraine would absolutely never even dare and never succeed, never be able to ever reach it. Well, February of 2026, almost 4 years into the beginning of this war, that shattered the belief. Not with loud speeches, not with dramatic declarations, but with fire, smoke and a very uncomfortable silence from Moscow. Ukraine did not just strike something symbolic, it struck something essential, something that feeds the entire military machine, something Russia cannot quickly replace, relocate or explain away with the usual excuses. And the most humiliating part for the Kremlin is not even the damage itself. It is the fact that this happened nearly 1,000 miles away, in a place Putin thought was completely untouchable. To understand why this changes everything, we need to look closely at where Ukraine struck, what was hit, and why this was not just a random act of defiance, but a part of a cold, methodical strategy. Let's start from the place itself that Putin thought was completely safe. Deep inside Russia's Perm region, near the Ural Mountains and along the Kama River, sits the industrial town called Gubakha. On a map, it looks completely harmless, quiet, boring even. Definitely not something you would expect to show up in a breaking war news. And that is precisely why it mattered. Gubakha is located roughly 1,600 kilometers away from Ukraine. That's around 1,000 miles. For the Kremlin, this distance was not just geography, it was a symbol, unreachable, therefore indestructible. The assumption was simple. Ukraine can barely reach border regions, let alone facilities buried this deep inside Russian industrial heartland. And well, before you know it, that assumption collapsed in a single night. According to reports that emerged last week, Ukrainian long-range drones reached and struck the Metafrax chemical plant in Gubakha. Not a warehouse, not a random depot, no, just a massive chemical production facility that plays a critical role in supplying materials used across Russia's military-industrial chain. Explosions were reported, fires broke out, workers were rushed into shelters, and suddenly, a place that was not supposed to exist in the war narrative became impossible to ignore. Metafrax is not just another factory. It produces substances like methanol, urea, hexamine, and other chemicals compounds that serve as building blocks for both industrial and military production. These are not things you can simply replace by flipping a switch. Chemical plants of this scale take years to build, certify, and fully integrate into supply chains. When something like this goes offline, even temporarily, it sends shockwaves far beyond the immediate site. And yet, right on schedule, Russia's defense ministry responded with, as you would expect it, a theater, the usual script. They claimed that multiple Ukrainian drones were successfully intercepted, but, well, conveniently, the same number of drones eyewitnesses say actually hit the plane, but I don't know who to even believe this right now. Yeah. The implication as always, according to the Ministry of Defense, is that the falling debris somehow caused fires precisely where production units are located, just there. I mean, how many times can this excuse be recycled before it becomes absurd even to those repeating it? But here is the core problem for the Kremlin. This was not a border clash. This was not a miscalculation near the front. This was a deliberate strike, planned, executed, and delivered deep inside Russian territory. Distance no longer protects anything, and once that illusion breaks, everything that follows becomes far more dangerous for Moscow. Which leads us directly to why this target was chosen even in the first place, and what it reveals about Ukraine's broader strategy. Something we definitely need to talk about in more details in our next chapter. Ukraine did not pick Metafrax because it looks impressive on a map. This was not about headlines or spectacle, it was about supply chains. Modern wars are not won by slogans or speeches. They are won by logistics, resources, and the ability to sustain pressure over time. Metafrax sits at a critical junction of that system. The chemicals produced there feed into multiple sectors, including the production of materials Russia relies on to maintain its military operations. So when a plant like that is disrupted, it does not just affect one shipment or one unit. It creates cascading problems. What makes this even more devastating is that Metafrax was already under international sanctions. So in theory, that should have slowed or limited its output, but in reality the plant keep operating. Sanctions, as effective as they can be at some point in the future, unfortunately work very slowly. And so Ukraine does not have the luxury of waiting, so instead of hoping restrictions would eventually do the job, Ukraine took matters into its own hands, just like they did multiple times in the past, and were never wrong with making this decision. If economic pressure was not enough to stop production, then physical disruption would. This is where the logic becomes brutal but effective. Every hour a facility like Metafrax is offline complicates Russia's ability to replenish stocks, maintain equipment, and sustain pressure on the battlefield. Even temporary shutdowns force rerouting, improvisation, and delays. And delays in a war of attrition matter far more than dramatic one-time events. But this strike did not happen in isolation. Almost simultaneously, Ukraine launched another deep strike that targeted a completely different but equally vital artery of Russia's war economy. This time, the focus shifted from chemicals to energy. Because if chemicals feed production, oil feeds everything else, literally. And that brings us to the Black Sea, where another carefully chosen target was set completely ablaze. Let's dig into that escalation and what it means in our next chapter. And just also, guys, almost forgot, if you want to see an additional chapter at the end of each episode, those will be uploaded to my Patreon. So if you want to see some bonus content and support our work we do here, please consider joining. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. Thanks so much. While attention was still focused on the Perm region, Ukrainian drones were already making their presence felt hundreds of miles to the south, in Russia's Krasnodar region. There, they stuck the Tamanavtogas oil terminal, a key hub in Russia's Black Sea export network. This was not just another facility, it's a part of one of the most important logistical corridors Russia uses to move oil to the shrinking list of buyers who are still willing to do business. Reports indicate direct hits, fires, and confirmed damage, and unlike the chemical plant, the consequences here ripple immediately into financial territory. Oil that cannot be loaded cannot be sold, terminals that are damaged cannot operate at full capacity, and ports that are repeatedly struck become far more expensive to insure, operate, and rely on. This is where Ukraine's strategy gets especially clever. The damage is not limited to what burns inside. Shipping data following the strike showed reduced tanker traffic. Fewer ships leaving means less oil moving, and less oil moving means less revenue, simple as that. And then there is also insurance. After repeated incidents in the Black Sea region, war risk premiums have surged. Insurance rates that once hovered below 1% of a ship's value jumped sharply. On paper they may not sound dramatic, but in practice it's devastating. Russia operates a massive shadow fleet, hundreds of aging tankers purchased to bypass restrictions and keep oil flowing. Each percentage point increase in insurance cost translates to into tens of thousands of dollars per ship per voyage. Multiply that across hundreds of vessels, and suddenly you're talking about tens of millions of dollars drained from the war budget without a single additional drone ever launching. This is literally death by 1,000 cuts executed with patience and precision. One strike disrupts logistics, another one raises costs, next one scares insurers, and the final one delays repairs. Over time, the cumulative effect is absolutely suffocating. And the most uncomfortable truth for the Kremlin is that none of this requires Ukraine to match Russia's tank for tank or missile for missile. It only requires Ukraine to keep targeting what matters the most. But perhaps the most unsettling question for Moscow is not what was hit. It is how these strikes keep succeeding. Russia, has air defenses, kinda expensive ones, layered ones even, and yet drones keep getting through. Which raises the obvious question. What changed? The answer lies in a surprisingly simple but ingenious adaptation that deserves its own final chapter. For all the talk of cutting-edge technology, one of Ukraine's most effective recent innovations does not look futuristic at all. It looks almost old-fashioned. Balloons. Yes, balloons. Not as a gimmick, not as a joke, but as a platform. Reports indicate that Ukraine has begun using high-altitude military balloons for reconnaissance, decoys, cargo delivery, and potentially as launch points for drones themselves. And from a tactical perspective, it makes sense, just think about it. Here's what it means. Balloons do not behave like drones. They are not vulnerable to the same electronic interference. They do not rely on constant GPS signals in the same way. They're way harder to detect on radars, especially when operating at higher altitude. Add solar panels, sensors, cameras, basic autonomy, and just like this, you suddenly have a persistent low-cost platform that can drift with the wind straight into Russian territory. Ukraine has even turned geography into its ally, as you can see. The dominant wind patterns naturally push objects eastward. Combine that with artificial intelligence models that predict weather and wind behavior, and just like this, you get a system that absolutely quietly bypasses defenses designed to counter fast, predictable threats. Balloons versus multi-million-dollar machines. From a high altitude, drones can be released closer to targets, shortening their vulnerable flight paths and increasing the chance of success as well. Was this method used in the Perm or Black Sea strikes? We don't know for sure, at least for now, but it would explain a lot. It would explain how drones are reaching deeper targets with increasing reliability. It would explain why air defenses seem stretched thin, reactive, and often ineffective. And most importantly, it would explain why facilities once considered safe are now suddenly exposed. This is not about flashy breakthroughs, it's about adaptability. Ukraine is combining old concepts with modern tools and applying them systematically. And that particular word systematically means. These are not just random acts, they are calculated moves designed to weaken Russia's capacity over time, drain its resources, and build leverage ahead of negotiations. What we're witnessing is not just a series of successful strikes, it's a shift in the logic of the war. Ukraine is no longer reacting, it is shaping the battlefield far beyond the front lines. Every deep strike undermines the narrative Moscow desperately tries to maintain, the narrative of control, of safety, of inevitability. When chemical plants burn 1,000 miles away and all terminals fall silent in supposedly secure regions, that story collapses. These operations weaken Russia materially, financially, and psychologically. They complicate production, choke revenue, and expose vulnerabilities Putin cannot admit without undermining his own authority. And they give Ukraine something just as important as battlefield gains. They give them leverage. Leverage of negotiations, leverage in messaging, leverage in proving that pressure will not ease just because talks are scheduled. Putin is trapped in the contradiction of his own making. He cannot stop without appearing weak, he cannot continue without bleeding resources faster than they can be replaced. And Ukraine's deep strike campaign is making that contradiction sharper with every passing week. Guys, if you want to keep following how these strategies evolve, how pressure is applied far beyond the headlines, and why the map of this war is changing in ways most people still underestimate, please make sure to subscribe to our channel. If you want to see some bonus content, once again, it's on my Patreon, link is down below. Thanks so much for watching. See you tomorrow.
We do not believe in ridiculous Russian propaganda.